An average day in the life of the painter. What time I get up in the morning? Normally about 6, depending on the light. After having some fruit, I potter around the pool, clear the filters, get the grubs off the citrus trees. And this is a process of preparing myself for work. It's a kind of routine I've got into, a kind of therapy, if you wish. Instead of sitting and clearing the mind before working, I do practical things so that by 8:30 or 9, when I get to the studio, I'm ready for work.
Frank Hodgkinson, at 77, is one of Australia's most industrious and versatile artists. In his working life, which began in the 1930s and spans more than 60 years, he has explored many mediums of artistic expression, from drawing and printmaking to painting and sculpture. Hardly a day passes without something new taking shape in his studio in Kenthurst, on the northern outskirts of Sydney.
I usually work in series, so there's no need to sit down and start thinking. In fact, I'd much rather not think. I'd much rather the thinking was done on the canvas. And I have a kind of conversation and a kind of love affair. And if I'm not involved in this love affair with the painting just doesn't work. And I'm not going to wait around for the muse. I'm going to grab the muse and give him a good kick in the slats and say, let's get on with it. It's a fairly solitary life. I suppose I spend most of my life entirely alone in the studio. The family had never come down here, or very rarely, and I'm alone. Never lonely. That's not part of it. My father was against me being an artist, and I had this desire quite early in the piece, even when I was going to school at Fort Street. I was the youngest of the family, and when I was at school at Fort Street between 1931 and 1936. And my father was out of work for some of that period, and he was a very proud man and refused to accept the dole. And so he brought us up on his savings, really. He was not very sympathetic towards the idea of me being an artist, though he used to collect a few paintings. And every time I asked him about studying art, he said he didn't want me to be an artist, that I was bright enough at school to become a doctor, and he dearly wanted a doctor in the family. I think he wanted someone to look after him in his old age. But I was determined that wasn't to be my vocation, and defied him. And finally, when I was about 16 and had just left school, I told him I was determined to study art, and he said he would not pay my fees, that I'd have to do some other sort of work and study at night. Which I did. I ran messages and did all that sort of thing. But finally, when I pestered him for a reason about artists, he said that he had known a lot of artists in his time, and they were all ne'er-do-wells, they were boozers and womanizers. And I said, gee, Dad, you make that sound very attractive. I don't think he ever forgave me for that comment.
I first met Frank Hodgkinson in the early 60s. I was 30. He was 40. We had recently returned after several years abroad as part of that early wave of artists who, immediately after the finish of World War II, felt it essential for their development to visit, study and work in Europe. A way to escape the sense of isolation that then pervaded Australia.
There wasn't much cultural activity in Australia at that time. In the field of music or painting, that sort of thing, there was greater emphasis upon music, I suppose. But in order to see great paintings, we had to travel. I mean, there were a few masterpieces in Melbourne, but more recently, many of those have been declared spurious. So it was imperative to move, but it cost money, and we had to save up hard to get there. And I know I had the ambition to travel when I was 18, 19, after I'd had a couple of years at art school here, mainly at night. But I couldn't raise the money. And when war broke out, I saw an opportunity to travel. It's a terrible thing to say because I suppose I was just about as patriotic as most Australians, but I wasn't keen about war. But I saw it as an opportunity to go overseas. And I really thought at that time the troops would be headed for Europe. And I had my discharge planned after the war in Paris. It didn't happen that way. The war changed course, France fell, and I found myself on a troop ship at that time, dumped in India, and then transported to the Middle East and into the western desert of North Africa, and then nearly on to Greece after that. Fortunately, Greece fell before we got there. We had been loaded onto ships, but then unloaded. And then we were sent up to Syria to fight the Vichy French. And that was a very mountainous, very unpleasant, short warfare, spasm of war. It lasted only 6 weeks. Then, when the Japanese came to the war, they transported us to Malaysia. And fortunately for us, Malaysia fell before we got there. We were once again dumped in India, this time in Ceylon, and transshipped back to Australia, and then almost immediately into New Guinea, where we walked over the Owen Stanley Ranges, and I finished the war in Borneo as a war artist, and was discharged in Sydney and had to pay my own fares to get to Europe. Paris showed all the evidence of war. There were bullet holes in walls all over the place. They were putting up plaques to resistance people who had been shot on street corners by the Nazis. It was joyous, nevertheless, and particularly amongst the students. None of us had any money at all. We lived in very cheap hotels. I got mixed up with a bunch of Greek students who were my own age, and were all in our 20s. They would introduce themselves as philosophers, at the age of, say, 25, 26 or something like that. And they said, what are you? And I said, well, I think I'm a student. And they said, yes, but you're a painter. And I said, well, I paint, but I'm still a student. I said, look, you're doing paintings. You are a painter. You're not a student. And they taught me to puff out my chest a bit and not be ashamed of being an artist, to be proud of it, and just speak openly and freely, be a little more macho in my approach to life. I was impressed by Matisse when I was much younger, and I found myself in many arguments with other painters who said that Matisse was purely a decorative painter. And during his lifetime, he had to suffer that criticism. But I always found him to be a very, very powerful draftsman and a brilliant colorist and innovator. But his painting, for me, is classic. And I'm still under his spell. When I'm thinking about color and composition, I go back to Matisse every time. I don't copy him, but he is the inspiration. He was the man who had the courage to use pure color and pure design. And he transcended the simply decorative. Spain has always been a mecca for me. As I said, Goya and Velázquez are still very favorite painters of mine. I think Goya was the strongest early influence I had. His sense of drama, his knowledge of the handling of paint, his directness, his sense of realism, his very passion, the appealing things about him as far as I'm concerned. His disasters of war, particularly, I've been interested in because I was a war artist, and I used him as an idol, as a standard. Goya had painted the bullfight, and I thought it would sicken me. But I was determined to see them because Goya had done some marvelous drawings, some of his best drawings of the bullfight. And I did actually paint a series on the bullfight, which was misunderstood when it was shown in Australia. The critics thought that I was not painting the true Spain. I was painting the tourist Spain, but the bullfight is Spain, as far as I'm concerned.
In 1947, Frank Hodgkinson made his first visit to Italy and discovered Florence.
I was so fascinated by the place. I just kept drawing. I spent most of the day, daylight hours, looking in the churches, museums. But when the museums closed, I drew and drew and drew. And I drew at night a tremendous amount, mainly because I couldn't afford to go anywhere. I stayed in a cheap pensione. But I enjoyed recording the place, and I was worried that, you know, the sketchbook's going to look like a cook's tour, but what the hell? I wanted to record it. I didn't have a camera in those days, and I'm very pleased that I didn't, because looking back on those drawings 50 years later, they have a quality which the camera could not record.
In 1995, Frank Hodgkinson went back to Florence.
I decided to go back with my eyes wide open and study not only the art, but the architecture of Florence, which was made, let's face it, by the artists of the day, people like Michelangelo. Brunelleschi was certainly an artist as well as being an architect. So the study of their buildings is a study of art. And it was simply a return to the actual thing. And eventually, when I've digested the work I've done, the drawings of Florence, perhaps I may be adventurous enough to abstract these drawings. But as it is, I've tried to bring some sense of otherness to them. For instance, I've drawn Florence as it is today, made these drawings about the scaffolding which dominates Florence. Lots of buildings are so covered up with drapery. I imagine they're cleaning the buildings, and there's a protective device so the public won't be disturbed by the cleaning process. Florence is a very romantic place. So I introduced in the call it the background or the sky behind the buildings and the scaffolding, certain paintings. And I chose, for a start, the paintings of Botticelli, because though I didn't like his work very much years ago, I've grown to feel that he is a true master and a Florentine master. His paintings are about the essence of Florence, the sheer romanticism of the place. In yet another drawing, I took characters, very well-known figures from paintings by Masaccio, Filippino Lippi, and I put them back on the street in front of the buildings, because that was where these great painters found them, on the street, and hired them as models. So it was a fun idea. It's not straight realism, far from it. I think I returned to Australia, having lived many, many years in Spain and Italy. And I found that Europe is one huge cultivated garden. And though it's very, very beautiful, it didn't satisfy the primitive in me. I'd like in my paintings, I try in my paintings to get back to the very primitive elements of life. It's impossible to live the life of a primitive man, but I'd like to clear my mind of all sorts of crud and all kinds of knowledge, and find out how original man felt and thought about things. I like to look at trees as though I'm seeing them for the first time. And each day I try to clear the mind of any knowledge I have about painting and begin again. I've simply kept sketchbooks, and part of these books are sketches. Sometimes they're more complete sketches, but frequently, traveling in a car or in a train, I haven't had time to really sketch the landscape or make any details of what I've seen. So I've written things like notes to myself about the quality of light of that particular day. And into those notes may creep some bit of information I've picked up about the country I'm passing through, what happened in the history and what I feel about it. And all these things are rather incomplete. The sketches are incomplete, the writing is incomplete. And because these things are incomplete, I find when I get back from journeys that these notes are much more useful to me than if I had done more complete things. Had I done more complete things on the spot, there would have been nothing else to do, or little else to do, but embellish what I had there. But the incomplete notes are very, very stimulating. They have instant recall for me back in the studio. Oh, through the years, I've done a lot of life drawing, and I've used extraordinary poses in order to emphasize certain aspects of the human figure. I don't like static poses. I don't like